Hello and welcome to Ask the Expert, the show where you can connect directly with the experts to get your questions answered. I'm James Truitt. I look after the Microsoft Alliance here at Datadog. And today we're discussing release management monitoring for Azure DevOps with Datadog. With me, I have Ryan McLean, our senior tech evangelist. Hey, Ryan.
How's it
If you're
going?
joining us live, please get your questions into the chat and let us know where you're asking those questions from, where you're coming from. If you're watching this on demand, welcome. Please be sure to check out the resources provided in the description for more details. So Ryan, tell us a little bit about yourself and what brings us here today.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm Ryan McLean. I'm a senior tech evangelist at Datadog, and I figured today we'd talk a little bit about monitoring release management. So we're talking a little bit about Azure DevOps. This could apply to GitHub Actions or what have you, and I'll talk about a few other strategies that we've got to monitor these pipelines as you're pushing them out. But essentially, as our pipelines become increasingly complex, ensuring that software is delivered on time while also maintaining quality, it's of the utmost importance. So this becomes particularly difficult when stages and stakeholders become dependent on each other. So for example, in a microservices environment, and we'll give an overall view of the deployment process across the organization and its accounts, projects, environments, and then we'll answer your questions live. So as James said, it'd be great if you could let us know in the chat where you're dialing in from. That would be awesome. All right. So a quick intro about myself. I mean, James kind of nailed it there. I'm a senior technical evangelist at Datadog. I'm currently working at Datadog. I've been here for about 2.5 years, but I've been using the product for almost 10 at this point in time. So I try to help our customers understand technology and how you can monitor it. And CICD and release management is no different. So I love to hike and take photos around beautiful Vancouver, Canada. You can find me on Twitter. My handle's there, or you can also email me directly. I've also left the email in there. So I've done release management at companies like Stem Cell and Finning within Canada. So if you're local to the West Coast, that might ring a bell. But also globally, I did quite a bit of release management at Samsung. So what I'll use is that experience to sort of talk about some strategies that I had in the field that helped me out, as well as ways that you can use Datadog to accomplish the same thing. And as James mentioned, I've also got him with me to help handle the questions and field anything that comes up. And he's our Microsoft Alliance Manager. So first, a quick intro to Datadog. I'll keep it super short, I promise. But Datadog is an observability platform that provides full visibility across your organization. So CI/CD and release management is no different. We enable everyone, that's operations, developers, security, even your business owners, to have a complete understanding of system and application performance by monitoring end-to-end from your infrastructure to network, to your applications and services, all the way to your end users. And it's easy to get up and running in just a few minutes. Datadog provides over 500 integrations to cover all of the apps, frameworks, languages, and third-party services you use. And again, so Azure and Microsoft, that ecosystem is certainly part and parcel of this. So from collecting critical data to out-of-the-box insightful dashboards to get you started quickly, to alerting and collaborative tools like PagerDuty or Microsoft Teams, we've made setup a breeze. Now, what I'd like to talk about is the cycle. So we'll call it like the virtuous cycle of CI/CD. So the things that you'll be doing on a daily basis, and the sort of the flow that you'll get into as you're releasing your software on a regular cadence. So basically, what we need to cover is kind of the 5 W's. So like the who, what, when, why, and where of this cycle. And I'll start with a quick example from Microsoft. So this is from the docs. You got a link there on the bottom. But this is essentially talking about how Microsoft would tell you to approach CI/CD in Azure DevOps when deploying software. So there's a lot going on here. I'll try to rifle through it really quickly. But for this one, so step one is kind of the developer changes the app code. So maybe there's a bug or something that we want to fix, maybe the colors, that kind of thing. Could be anything. Could be look and feel, could be a new name, maybe some language changes, that kind of stuff. The code's committed to a source code repo. We're talking about Azure DevOps today, but it could be GitHub or GitHub Actions, that kind of thing. It doesn't really matter for this. For the purposes of this convo, we'll talk more about Azure DevOps. But that continuous integration is then triggered by a pipeline that will run your tests, builds your solution, and that can be hosted on Azure Pipelines or GitHub Actions. That pipeline will generate an unsigned MSIX package or M6 package. Again, this could be an EXE or what have you. It sort of depends on your environment. If you're in the Java space, maybe it's a jar. If it's Python, maybe you're pushing it to PyPy or a pip package, that kind of thing. It really depends what you're doing. But again, we're going to use this as sort of an example and then talk about it in more generics. So that continuous deployment is then triggered by another stage of the pipeline. The M6 package will deploy to your distributing platform, and then it's signed off with a trusted cert. And then that trusted package is then deployed to a static website. In this case, we'll talk about hosting it on Azure storage, but it could be hosted in another location. If these are on-prem, for example, they could be on a file share. And then every time a developer commits a new update to the repo, that new M6 package will be generated and pushed following the same workflow. So this is for like a desktop app. So if you're in sort of the client server, I guess like pipeline, this is what that would look like. But in a more generic sense, if we were to like bubble up what this looks like on multiple platforms, it kind of boils down to 8 steps. So you've got your code, so you're tracking your code commits, pull requests, determining which version of your code has been deployed. Then you're building, engaging the time for each build. Then you're testing your build, making sure like, hey, can I run security tests against this? Are there any resource requirements? How much RAM does this one require prior to my last release? And then the same thing. So when we get into the release, after doing our tests, we've got things like approval, getting your pull requests, getting your release notes together, signing off. And then finally, we'll get into sort of the action phase. So the deploying, the operating, the monitoring, the plan. So deploying, in case you've not covered this before, it means pushing your stuff into an environment. It could be a test environment, staging, QA, even production. Then you get into operating. So what does your day 2 look like? Is there anything found in your lower environment, in your test environment, your QA environment, maybe your staging prior to going to prod? If you're doing blue-green, what does that look like before you flip the switch? And then you're getting the monitoring. So what does normal look like? So over the course of like the 4 hours of your first deployment, your 8 hours in a microservice environment, how does it look like when it talks to other services? And then planning. So with all that information that you've got from these previous steps, you can start building things like runbooks or documentation or things like an on-call plan, that kind of stuff. Figuring out what happens post-release, what do we need to know? And then for the next release, so as we circle back into your code, build, test, and release, what does that look like? What do we need to know for these steps? What do we need to improve? What do we need to address? Again, I'm rifling through this pretty quickly, but on our end, we've got some pretty good tools to help you with visibility of these tests as you're going forward. There's a quick little link here on the bottom that I'll pop to in a second here. So we've got a product called the CI Visibility that you can certainly use, but we'll talk about things a little bit more generic sense as we go through the questions here. And then finally, we talk about things like if you want to deploy something, what does that look like? So once it's deployed in these lower environments, how do we start getting info back from these? So hopefully that wasn't too long, but we'll get into question times here. So if we've got any questions, pop them into the chat and I'll see if I can answer them there. What have we got? Okay, so the first question is, what's Datadog? Hopefully I've answered that one, James. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree, and I'm sure throughout this conversation, right, as you can show and speak more about how we use Datadog to monitor release management, we can help illustrate what Datadog is. Let's start with the first question we had here, Ryan. You covered a ton of ground in that intro, but yeah, where do I start? What would you recommend?
Yeah, so I'm going to quickly pop back here into the slides, and I'll get into this sort of the virtuous cycle. So when we're talking about where to start, it kind of depends where you are right now. So the easiest, obviously, is if you're greenfield. So if this is new to you and you've not done CICD or release management, if you're manually pushing things out, I would say that the main thing to do as you start is to set like a base level. So the question would be, the question I always have is, if I had to do a security fix today and push things out to production, not test, dev, or QA, how long would that take? So if I had, let's say it's just a change from, and I'm saying just here, the just is carrying quite a bit of weight, but if I had to change from SSL to TLS, or maybe TLS 1.2 to 1.3. So if I had to change the security of my backend API or of a package that I'm pushing out, or change a cert, how long would that take? Is that something that you'd measure in minutes? Is it hours? Is it days? Is it weeks? Is it months? And in some cases, depending on the environment that you're in, is it years? And I'm not saying this to gatekeep or anything like that. It's fine wherever you are, but the first thing you want to do is level set. So determine how long it takes you to build out and push to production, so all the way through those other steps to get there. And in some cases, you might not have a staging environment. You might not have a test environment. You might not even have QA. You might just have one environment. And that's, again, totally fine. But what we want to do is set up that expectation. So figure out if it's a year, that's fine. If it's a year and 1 day, maybe shaving that off is a little bit better. Sometimes looking at that process can be very handy. Now, once we've timed it out, and I'll try to make this short and sweet, but once we've timed it out, what I'd like to do generally when I'm approaching something new like this is to figure out at which stage we're taking longer. Now, when we're in the year-long cycles, typically it's around the release phase. So getting approvals and sign-off is generally where you'll be spending a little bit more time. And it could be that you're doing monolithic deployments. So you're taking many things and putting them together prior to releasing, or that you've got tight dependencies between different areas. And because of that, you need to get them all collected prior to release. And again, that's fine. Sometimes, though, to help that phase, you can actually shift a little bit left to testing to figure out if you can check some of those checkboxes off prior to that phase. And again, if testing is the one that's longer, then maybe the build phase could be a little bit faster in order to do things like test as we build. And similarly, if the build phase is long, if the test phase is long, sometimes you can do things like linting in your code that will help you in those phases. So James, sorry if that was a little bit long, but that's generally what I take in terms of an approach, is to figure out like how long it takes, what's the longest part of that process, and then figuring out how to shorten that and shift left as much as possible. Sometimes one step, sometimes shifting left two, and going from there.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Next question. Tell me about the easiest way to observe pipelines.
Right. So I would say, this is my opinion. I would say the easiest way for you to observe a pipeline is to start timing them. Now, I've timed pipelines manually. So I've actually had like a stopwatch to figure out how long it takes to start and stop things. Again, just setting a baseline. Now, in the Microsoft ecosystem, there's a lot of things you can do to script starting up an app, doing something, and figuring out what's actually happened. So, for example, if it's double clicking an exe, figuring out how long it takes to load, and then performing a process within it, totally fine. I would say, on the other hand, when it comes to web-based tools or things that are even encapsulated in a web-based tool, so something like VS Code, for example, like where you've got a frame around web code, it's a little bit easier to start automating those processes and actually deploying them and then testing them. So on the Datadog side, we've got something called synthetics, which I love to talk about. So imagine a macro for a website. So you've deployed your website and you want to test to see how long it takes to go through a cart. So what we can do is actually have you load, it's basically a little plugin into something like Microsoft Edge or Chrome or what have you. And what you can do is record the actions as you're going through a site and figure out how long those actions take per step, which is great, especially in the microservice environment where you've got many things talking to each other. It can let you know which process is slower. And not only that, but it can allow you to do it from multiple locations. Now, when you're loading that site up, the other thing that we can help with is RUM. So that's real user monitoring. RUM is something like, imagine when you load the page, it will load a little script that will allow you to see what's happening on the page. So if you added a new framework, let's say you're using Angular and you're moving to Angular 2, you want to figure out how long it takes from you clicking on the page to it loading the next page. RUM can be, essentially, it's like a leg up. It will let you actually drill down into exactly what's happening on the page. And this is more in that test phase, but allow you to observe that page as it's turning on, spinning up, and figuring out what's going on. Now you can dial this all the way back into something like I've pushed this into a VM. How long does it take for the VM to load the page in IIS? Or if it's something like I've pushed a backend microservice and I want to know that my load balancers swap from one to the other end to be able to tell me which version I'm running and for which version, which is faster. So let's say you're gating your deployments, basically. So this is a little bit more advanced, but basically if you're already in the advanced stage and you want to start observing, one of the things we can allow you to do when you're in that area is gate your pipeline. So essentially, some of the easiest ways to observe the pipeline is to say like, hey, the site's not up. I should probably stop my pipeline and not continue, that kind of thing. So it really depends on the maturity level of where you are in this process. But I would say those are kind of the three main things for me. So synthetics would be the first easy one if it's a web-based site. The second is RUM, and the third would be getting the deployment. So depending on your maturity level, I'd kind of attack it from one of those angles.
Great, thanks, Ryan. We've got a bunch more questions to get through, so I'm going to keep you keep you moving along here.
Gotcha. I'll
Tell
try
me
to
about
answer more quickly. Sorry.
what is a flaky test, Ryan?
Super good question. So a flaky test, a lot of people will assume a flaky test means that every time I run a test, I'll get different results. But what's key is every time I run a test on the same commit, I will get different results. So imagine something like you're calling an API and you've put like a sleep on it, sleep for 5 seconds. So you expect that the API will respond within 5 seconds. So we're running fine, same commit. We're running a bunch of tests in the test environment, and we notice that sometimes the API doesn't answer. And because the API isn't answering, we're failing in tests. So succinctly, a flaky test is a test that with nothing else changing, the test may pass or may fail. And a good example for me is when you're using sleep instead of testing that an API is responding properly. You've actually just said like sleep 5 seconds or sleep 60 seconds and assume that it's going to respond correctly. And because of that, the next time you run a test, it may fail or it may pass, regardless of the code, because something in your test actually has an external dependency, often causing a flaky test. Now, some of this can be math-based or time-based, that kind of stuff, but this is a pretty easy example.
Awesome. Thanks. Hey, earlier you were talking about gating releases.
Right.
Can you describe what that means in a bit more detail?
Yeah, I probably dove a little bit into the deep end there. Sorry, or maybe I'm foreshadowing. So gating releases would be imagine that you're going through your pipeline. So the one that we were talking about. So you're at the test, release, and deploy phase. So you've done a test. You're about to release. You pop something into the hopper. So it's in the pipeline. It's ready to go, and your pipeline has many steps. Now imagine one of those steps is to build a new VM, and that takes about 30 minutes, and deploying the VM takes about 5. But prior to getting there, what you can do is when you do like your build and then you're about to release it, you're doing something like a smoke test or maybe like a dry run kind of thing just to make sure that it will land where it goes. If that step fails, or if something like you baked the VM and turned it on, but it's not actually ready to receive any traffic, or it didn't get an IP address, or something else has failed, instead of following down that full 30, 35 minute, 45-minute path, maybe you should stop there. Or if it's something like a Docker container that you're building and then pushing up to a repo, but the repo doesn't accept the container, maybe it's credentials, maybe it's the cert expiration, that you don't continue on that process, that you'll gate the release. So basically saying, hey, check to see if it's failed. If it's failed, do not proceed, then send an email or what have you. Instead of pushing it all the way out and figuring out after 45 minutes that it's failed, essentially getting that rapid feedback cycle so that you're not wasting time.
Perfect. Thanks. Ryan, you've talked a lot about different sort of CICD concepts, DevOps concepts. Can you help tie this into sort of how Datadog helps bring this all together, makes it easier, allows that observability across the stack?
I love it. It's like a softball question. So I would say, like, when we're looking at all of these phases, the main thing, and what I really loved about Datadog, and one of the main reasons I joined the company, is that we allow you to look at every phase of this process. Now, I started out in the infrastructure side, so more on the operation side. So for me, things like CPU, memory, storage, networking, those are kind of, I won't call them given, but they're sort of what you'd expect as a baseline. But what we allow is basically, once you've got that up and running, to tie in your cloud services as well. So imagine figuring out like, hey, if you're running Kubernetes or Kubernetes as a service, or maybe you're in an app service environment or Azure application service, that kind of thing, tying in that backend with the infrastructure, with the code monitoring, with the CI/CD visibility, and on top of that, your code visibility. So going all the way down into traces, logs, and metrics, and bubbling up to your cloud all together. So being able to see that big picture, but being able to also drill down into it and then pivot between traces, logs, and metrics, I think it essentially makes this so much easier than what I used to do in the past with like Tomcat and Jenkins and going into each one. And then you've got like 20 screens of 20 servers watching all the logs at the same time. It's so much easier to consolidate this all in the same place. Now, I won't say single pane of glass. Maybe you've got like multiple dashboards, or maybe you're creating them on the fly, but that ease of use with the canned dashboards and being able to like clone them and add things to them to make a bespoke, essentially like either an incident dashboard or a CI/CD visibility tool for your application, or your application and your upstream. So services you depend on, and your downstream. So services that depend on you, applications all in one together. I think it's second to none. But that's just me. I'm biased because I've used the tool for a while, but I really think that view of all of that together. So if it's like a hybrid cloud, you're on-prem and the cloud, or if you're doing multi-cloud, or if you're using multiple environments at the same time, being able to see all that together, I think is key.
Thanks, Ryan. Yeah, that ease of use and integration, makes for a really powerful story. Hey, can you tell me a little bit more about what I can do to check deployments in my test environments?
Yeah, so that's pretty open-ended. So the first thing I'd say is in your test environment, so this might not be an integration environment. So it might be just you mocking out some services, that kind of thing. The main thing I'd say is like checking your like how long does it take to get to your test environment. So checking your deployments, making sure that you're timing your deployments, figuring out how long that process takes is the first step. Similar to what I was saying before. So that's kind of key is the time. The second is figuring out like who's involved in this process and making sure that they have access to the same information as you. So again, if this is a team that depends on you and they're waiting for your feature to release because you're tied on something prior to releasing the product. So say you're working on the front end and someone else is working on the back end, being able to share that kind of thing together, I think is really key in the test environment. The second thing I'll say, I'm not sure if there's three here, but the second one I'll say is tagging. So making sure that you know that you're in your test environment and that you're not in staging, you're not in prod, you're not in something like that, making sure that you're tagging it. So making sure that you're tagging your test environment. And then I guess there is a third, making sure you know which version you're looking at. Those are super key. So in the past, and I'm sure some people on the call have seen this before, that it works on my PC is quite common. These days, it might be something more like it works on my Kubernetes cluster, or it works in my test environment if you get multiples, or it works in my Docker container. Making sure that you're tagging these things and tagging them not only with your environment that you've got, your release that you've got, maybe your owner, something like that, who's responsible for it. Those are very, very key for me, at least in the test environment phase. So making sure that there's essentially communication, but also let's say you took vacation and someone wants to figure out what's going on in that environment, that you've left breadcrumbs. So ways that people can look at what's happening in the test environment and figuring out where you were. So what your incremental steps were and where you are at that process. So that's kind of my approach to it. Other people might say documentation, and certainly that's important, but I would start there.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. So I think we've got less than 10 minutes left. So if folks that are joining us live have questions top of mind for Ryan, please don't be shy. Enter them in the chat. Ryan, tell me a little bit more about which CI/CD tools Datadog supports.
A lot. So off the top of my head, the ones that I haven't necessarily used too much, I would say, so I think there's BuildKite is one. There's GitHub Actions. We talked about Azure DevOps, Jenkins. Help me out here. Where are the other three? There's so many. I think there's 7. There's 6. James is blanking.
You put me on the spot.
I'll pull them up. But essentially what we're trying to do is figuring out where a Datadog can be involved in the products that you're using and making sure that we can come to you. So if there's one missing here, let me know. But I think off the top of my head, I think I mentioned GitHub Actions, Jenkins, Circle CI, BuildKite, and I believe the last one is GitLab. So that sort of covers all of them. And then Azure DevOps as well is something that we can help you with gating the deployment. So if you're in the Azure DevOps space, if you go into the marketplace area, there's one for getting deployments. There's also another one for just monitoring Azure DevOps itself. So if you've got things like if you're using the boards, for example, figuring out how many new tickets or issues or work pieces of work that are related per day, we can actually help you monitor those as well.
Awesome. So we're getting close to the end, but Ryan, I want to give you a chance. Is there anything else that you want to share today that you're excited about, with respect to release management monitoring with Azure and Datadog?
Yeah, like a lot of what I used to do as a consultant was going into shops and figuring out like where they were and sort of level setting and figuring out where they want to be and how to get there. I think the main thing that I'm excited about going forward is getting people involved in this monitoring process. So again, there's no gatekeeping. If you want to get started, just timing, that kind of thing, using a stopwatch, that kind of thing, that really gets me excited. It's like when you're starting from zero and it's greenfield and your goal is to figure out what that cycle looks in order to get things released. For some reason that really excites me. So one person asked if there's a demo. So there will be a link here in a moment that definitely has a ton of demos for CI/CD. There's also a really good YouTube video about synthetics for CI/CD. Maybe we can pop a link for that in the chat. But I would say the main thing that excites me is being able to peer into all of these phases at this point in time using one tool is phenomenal. So Azure DevOps was definitely like a big kind of aha moment for me. The fact that you could track your work, your pipelines, your builds, your tests all together. And I feel like Datadog really links quite well with Azure DevOps on each step of those phases. Not only for like your day zero, so prior to the deployment, and your day ones when you're actually deployment, but especially in like your day two. So once things are deployed out there, what does it look like in each of these environments? And then maybe day 500. So what does the security of my environment look like? What does the governance look like? What is the cost model, or what should I look like in different regions? That kind of stuff. That kind of has me super excited, because you can look at like each aspect, different lenses for each aspect of the deployment process.
Awesome. That's probably a great place to wrap up. Ryan, thanks so much today for sharing your expertise and perspective. I learned a lot. Hopefully folks joining the session live and on demand did as well, and they can reach out and follow up if they have other questions. We're happy to connect and super excited to share what's possible with Datadog and Azure DevOps. So thanks, Ryan. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you so much, James.